They told us it was just another sweep, another mission into the mountains of Afghanistan, into the dust and silence that had swallowed thousands before us. By then, the year was 2002, and most of the heavy fighting had passed. Tora Bora had already become a name whispered in mess halls and briefing rooms, a place spoken of in half-truths and rumor. The caves there were supposed to be cleared, combed through countless times, marked and mapped by soldiers before us. On paper, there was nothing left worth finding, but the brass wanted us to go anyway. The official orders said we were conducting a weapons search, a standard sweep to ensure no stockpiles, no hidden stashes, no stragglers waiting to regroup. But even before we landed, the whispers started. The locals told stories of soldiers disappearing, whole squads vanishing without a trace. They said the mountain itself was cursed, that its caves weren't just tunnels carved into stone, but gateways to something else. At first, we brushed it off. Every war zone comes with rumors. Every battlefield has its ghost stories. But deep down, each of us carried the weight of those words. We rode in by chopper, the blades thundering against the thin air. From above, the mountains looked endless, like jagged teeth gnawing at the sky. Tora Bora wasn't just rock and dust. It was a fortress of stone, riddled with shadows. Looking down, I saw the dark mouths of caves, yawning open, waiting for us. My stomach turned at the sight. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about those caves that felt hungry. When we hit the ground, the air was different. Thin, cold, sharper than anywhere else we'd been. My breath came out in short bursts of fog, even though it wasn't winter. The silence was crushing. No gunfire, no animals, not even the sound of the wind through the rocks. Just an endless, unnatural stillness. It felt less like stepping into a combat zone and more like walking into a mausoleum. Our sergeant kept us tight. No one said much. It wasn't fear of the enemy. We'd all seen worse in firefights. This was different. It was the kind of quiet that made you paranoid, like something was watching from every shadow. Each step echoed louder than it should have. Even the crunch of boots on gravel seemed wrong, swallowed up by the mountain. We made our way to the first entrance, a black slit in the rock, no wider than a hallway. The closer we got, the colder the air became. I glanced at Ramirez, the youngest in our squad. His lips trembled as he muttered under his breath. "Feels like a freezer," he said. He wasn't wrong. I pulled my jacket tighter, but the chill cut straight through the fabric, crawling across my skin. Inside, the beam of my flashlight pierced the darkness, catching on jagged walls and dust hanging heavy in the air. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, swallowing us one step at a time. The deeper we went, the more the silence pressed in like a weight on our chests. Even the static of the radios grew faint, replaced by a low hum that none of us could explain. I remember glancing at the walls. They weren't smooth, not like the caves I'd seen before. These were carved, etched with lines, shapes, markings that didn't belong to any language I knew. At first, I thought it was graffiti, something left by fighters long before us. But as my light traced the patterns, I realized they were older, much older. Symbols that didn't look military at all. Curves, spirals, faces, watching faces. I wanted to say something, but before I could, Carter, our radioman, froze. His headset crackled. We all stopped, turning to him. The sound was faint at first, buried in static, then clear as day, a voice cut through. Not Pashto, not Arabic, English. A single word, whispered, "Get out." We all froze. My heart stopped cold. Carter ripped the headset off, shaking his head. "It's interference," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Has to be." But the look in his eyes said otherwise. We pushed on, deeper into the tunnel. The further we went, the more the air changed. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was heavy, damp, pressing against our lungs. Each breath felt like dragging ice through my chest. My flashlight caught something in the dust ahead. A figure slumped against the wall. Ramirez was the first to approach. Rifle up, he crouched low, motioning us closer. It was a body, U.S. uniform. Boots, gear, patches, still clinging to faded fabric. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe it was someone missing in action, someone alive after all these years. But when Ramirez touched the man's shoulder, the truth hit us like a hammer. The body collapsed in on itself, skin gray and stretched thin, cracking at the slightest touch, bones dry, hollow, no decay, no rot, just dust, as if every ounce of life had been drained long ago. His dog tags clinked softly against the floor. Us'll never forget the sound that followed. A whisper, low but clear, drifting through the tunnel. It wasn't static, it wasn't our radios. It was right there around us, inside us. The same voice as before, cold and hollow. Get out. We stood frozen, rifles trembling in our hands. None of us spoke, none of us had to. Every one of us knew in that moment, we weren't alone in these caves. We didn't speak for a long time after finding that body, if you could even call it a body anymore. The dust of what was once a man clung to our gloves, to the floor, to the air itself. I remember Ramirez shaking his hand like he could fling it off, but the gray powder stuck, as if the dead wanted to stay with him. Nobody wanted to admit what we were all thinking. That man had been one of ours, and he hadn't just died, he'd been emptied, hollowed out. The sergeant tried to regain control. We keep moving, he ordered, voice rough. But I caught the way his eyes darted toward the tunnel walls, avoiding the corpse. He didn't want to look at it any longer than necessary. None of us did. We pressed on. The tunnel narrowed, stone pressing close on both sides, and our lights flickered against rough carvings, gouged deep into the rock. At first I thought they were cracks from explosions. But no, these lines had purpose. They formed symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals, jagged slashes, almost like writing, but not in any language I'd ever seen. The deeper we went, the more the markings appeared, as though the rock itself was trying to tell us something. Carter muttered, "Feels like walking through a damn storybook." His voice echoed too loudly, bouncing off the stone. Then his radio hissed again. We froze. At first, just static. Then came that same voice, faint, breathless. "Leave." The words slithered through the static like something alive. This time, more than one of us heard it. Ramirez ripped his earpiece out and threw it to the ground. His breathing quickened. "That's not comms," he said. "That's not..." He didn't finish, because just ahead, the tunnel widened into a chamber, and what we saw there stopped us in our tracks. The chamber was littered with remnants, gear, torn clothing, rusted metal that might once have been rifles. But at the center, half collapsed against the stone, was another figure. Unlike the last one, this one wasn't dust. His form was intact, though wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. His face was gaunt, stretched tight like leather, lips drawn back to expose yellowed teeth, eyes wide open, frozen in a look of terror. The strangest part, he was in full US uniform, but the patches were old, Vietnam era. My brain scrambled for an explanation. He couldn't have been here. He couldn't have. "Impossible," Carter whispered. "That SEP's decades. That SEP's not." Before we could react, the chamber filled with sound, not static this time, not whispers, but voices, layers of voices, dozens of them, echoing all at once, overlapping in languages I recognized and others I didn't. Russian, English, Pashto, screams, pleas, shouts for help, cries of pain. It was as if the walls themselves were alive with every voice that had ever died here. The lights flickered violently. Our beams swept across the stone, catching glimpses of movement, shadows darting just beyond the reach of the light. My heart hammered as I spun my rifle left then right, searching. There was nothing there. Only the suggestion of shapes, watching us from the dark. Ramirez cursed and stepped back, but his boot struck something on the ground. A helmet. Old, dented, Soviet make. He picked it up with shaking hands. The inside was scorched, blackened as though it had been in fire, and yet no fire had touched this chamber. "Sergeant," I whispered. My throat felt tight, dry. "What the hell is this place?" The sergeant didn't answer. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. I saw his hand trembling where it gripped his rifle. For a man who'd been through years of combat, it was the first time I'd ever seen fear etched into his features. Then Carter's radio screamed. Not static this time, just a blood-curdling scream that seemed to claw straight into our skulls. He ripped the headset away, but the sound didn't stop. It poured from the walls themselves, bouncing off the stone, surrounding us until I thought my head would split open. And just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. A silence that pressed down on us, thick and suffocating. The chamber seemed to grow darker, our lights weaker, as if the cave was swallowing them whole. Then I saw it. At the far end of the chamber, carved into the stone, was a message, fresh, scratched deep into the wall with something sharp. The letters were crude, jagged, but unmistakably English. Don't follow the voices. I felt my stomach drop. My mouth went dry because none of us had written it, and none of us had been in this chamber before. Ramirez whispered, "Then who the hell did?" The sergeant finally spoke, his voice shaking more than I'd ever heard before. "Stay sharp. Eyes open. We move." But it wasn't an order anymore. It was desperation. And in that moment, we all knew something had been here before us. Something was still here, and it did not want us to leave. We pressed forward, but the feeling never left. The sense that eyes followed from every shadow, that the mountain itself was alive, watching, waiting. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the mission, but the words carved into stone echoed in my head with every step we took deeper into the mountain's gut. Don't follow the voices. But by then, it was already too late. The nights in Tora Bora carried a silence that was heavier than any sound. When the sun dipped below the jagged cliffs and the icy winds began to creep down from the peaks, the soldiers often said the mountain came alive, not with gunfire, not with enemy combatants, but with something far stranger and infinitely more unnerving. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A rustle in the brush, a whisper that could be explained as wind weaving through the narrow stone passages. The human brain, after all, tries to make sense of chaos. And in places where survival hinges on every detail, even the smallest anomaly feels magnified. But night after night, reports began to repeat. Different soldiers, different squads, yet they described the same things, muffled voices echoing from the cliffs, the sensation of being followed by unseen eyes, and the chilling feeling of breath on the back of their necks when no one was there. Private Lang, a young recruit from Ohio, was among the first to break the silence about it. Sitting by the dim glow of a lantern, he whispered to his squad mates that he'd heard voices speaking in a language he couldn't recognize. Words that didn't sound like Dari, Pashto, or even Arabic. It was like chanting, he muttered. His face pale and drenched in sweat, his fellow soldiers laughed it off, suggesting it was exhaustion, dehydration, or just the tricks of a nervous mind. Yet within days, others reported the same thing. The whispers grew bolder. Sometimes they drifted through the camp when the wind was dead still, low enough to be almost inaudible, but distinct enough that the men swore it wasn't their imagination. One soldier claimed he heard his name being called in perfect English, only to turn and find no one behind him. Another insisted he saw shadows moving in the moonlight, long, skeletal figures gliding along the mountain walls, but when he raised his rifle to aim, the shapes dissolved into the darkness. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became scarce. Men tossed and turned in their sleeping bags, jolting awake at phantom footsteps or the feeling of weight pressing down on their chests. Some described dreams so vivid that they blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Visions of faceless figures standing at the mouth of the cave, or spectral hands clawing at the walls of their shelter. What made it worse was the unexplainable consistency. These weren't isolated accounts or stories shared around a fire that planted ideas in weary minds. Soldiers stationed miles apart, with no opportunity to speak to one another, described nearly identical encounters. The whispers, the shadows, the dreams. One night, Sergeant Daniels, a battle-hardened veteran with years of combat under his belt, admitted to his men that he too had been hearing the voices. This wasn't a man prone to superstition, nor was he one to show weakness, but his voice trembled when he recounted an experience that shook him to his core. He said he had been standing guard at the edge of camp when he felt a hand grip his shoulder. Startled, he spun around, weapon raised, but there was nothing, only darkness and stone. Then, in the faint echo of the cave walls, he heard a whisper, unmistakably clear, "You don't belong here." From that night onward, Daniels carried himself differently. He spoke less, his eyes darting to the shadows more often than before. It was as if he had seen something, or perhaps understood something, that he couldn't explain, and that knowledge weighed on him. The officers tried to rationalize the growing unease. They told the men it was stress, that fatigue and fear could play tricks on even the sharpest minds. But deep down, the soldiers knew it wasn't that simple. There was an energy in Tora Bora, something that could not be chalked up to psychology or war. The mountains seemed to hum with it, an ancient presence that lingered in the air like static before a storm. Some began to speculate. They wondered if the caves had once been burial sites, or if the jagged cliffs were cursed grounds that had absorbed centuries of blood and suffering. After all, Tora Bora had seen countless conflicts long before the US arrived. Empires had risen and fallen in those very mountains. Could it be that the echoes of those who had perished here still wandered the cliffs, restless and angry? As days turned into weeks, the whispers in the dark no longer felt random. They carried patterns, rhythms. Sometimes they came in the hours before dawn, almost as though timed to test the soldiers' breaking points. Other times they rose when tensions in the camp were highest, as if feeding on fear, growing stronger with every ounce of doubt. The soldiers felt less like they were being haunted and more like they were being studied, watched, toyed with. The breaking point came when one squad, positioned deep in a narrow valley near the cave systems, reported an incident that defied explanation. According to their account, they awoke in the dead of night to the sound of boots crunching in the gravel just outside their perimeter. Thinking they were under enemy approach, they scrambled into defensive positions, but instead of gunfire, they were met with a chilling chorus of whispers, dozens of overlapping voices, weaving together in an otherworldly cadence that froze them in place. They swore the sound was coming from everywhere at once, above, below, behind, within the very air they breathed. By the time they gathered the courage to fire flares into the night sky, the voices ceased. The valley fell silent once more. But the men emerged from that night shaken, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling. Some refused to sleep for days after, terrified of what they might hear if they let their guard down. For soldiers trained to face bullets, bombs, and the horrors of combat, this was a new kind of terror. An unseen enemy, an unknowable force. Something that could not be killed, could not be fought, and could not be explained. And yet it was as real to them as the mountains that surrounded them. The whispers in the dark had become more than just a chilling phenomenon. They were a reminder that Tora Bora was not just a battlefield. It was something older, something deeper, something that didn't care about wars or politics. And whatever it was, it had noticed them. The caves of Tora Bora were more than hollow chambers of stone. To the soldiers who ventured inside, they felt like lungs that breathed, or perhaps like throats that swallowed them whole. The deeper one went, the more the air changed. Heavy, damp, metallic, tinged with something faintly sulfurous. Some said it smelled like rot, others like burned earth, but no one could deny that the caves carried a presence all their own. For decades, perhaps centuries, these caverns had been carved, expanded, abandoned, and reused by one group after another. Fighters in the Soviet war once crouched in the same chambers the US soldiers now explored. Before that, shepherds and villagers spoke of smugglers and bandits using them as hideouts. And long before that, whispered legends told of ancient armies lost in these mountains. Their bodies never recovered, their spirits doomed to wander the dark tunnels forever. The soldiers called them the breathing caves. At night, the wind howled through narrow fissures, carrying moans and wails that seemed almost human. When the men tried to light fires for warmth, the smoke sometimes swirled unnaturally, clinging to the walls like phantom hands. Radios cut in and out, their signals scrambled not by terrain but by something less tangible. One patrol, led by Corporal Ruiz, entered a narrow shaft to map the interior for possible enemy hideouts. As they moved deeper, the sound of dripping water echoed around them, amplifying into a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. Drip, 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 like a clock, marking the passage of time. After 20 minutes, they realized they had been walking in circles. Ruiz swore they had been heading straight, yet the cave spat them back to where they started. The men looked at one another in silence. each afraid to admit the same thing: the cave had turned them around, deliberately, as though it did not want them inside. Later, another group went in with more equipment: compasses, marking tape, laser pointers. Even then, their instruments betrayed them. The compass needles spun erratically, the tape they had laid as a guide was found torn or missing, and the laser beams seemed to bend when they struck the uneven walls. "These caves don't follow our rules," one soldier muttered afterward, his face pale and drawn. "It's like they're alive." The strangest accounts, though, weren't about being lost. They were about being found. Private Jensen claimed he saw figures at the far end of a cavern. Men in tattered clothing, their faces obscured by shadow. Thinking they were enemy combatants, he raised his weapon, but his squadmates saw nothing. "They were watching us," he insisted, his voice shaking. "They were standing right there." Others described hearing footsteps behind them that stopped whenever they turned, or the faint sound of children laughing in the dark. One soldier, already frayed from weeks without proper rest, collapsed in panic when he heard what he swore was his mother's voice calling his name from the depths of the cave. What unnerved the men most was the sense of memory that clung to the stone, as if the walls themselves remembered every scream, every drop of blood spilled within them. Some caves gave the impression of shrines, lined with crude carvings and scratches that no one could explain. Marks gouged deep into the rock, too deliberate to be natural, but too old to belong to any modern hand. The soldiers touched them and felt a strange heat radiating from the grooves, as if the stone itself still burned with the pain of whatever had left those marks behind. Sergeant Daniels, who had already admitted to hearing whispers outside, began to say that the caves were worse. During one mission, he led his team into a chamber where the ceiling arched like the ribs of a giant beast. They stood in silence, listening, when Daniels suddenly ordered them out. He wouldn't say why until later, when pressed by his men. His answer was simple and chilling. Because the cave was breathing, and it wasn't breathing in, it was breathing out. Word of the cave spread quickly among the soldiers. Some refused to go inside without prayer or ritual, muttering lines from the Bible or reciting verses from the Quran. Others tried to mask their fear with jokes, calling it the mountain's welcome party, but their nervous laughter never lasted long. The caves had a way of stripping away bravado, leaving even the toughest men with the raw, vulnerable knowledge that they were intruders in a place they didn't belong. The psychological strain began to fracture the unit. Soldiers became short-tempered, arguments flared over small mistakes, and more than one patrol returned early, claiming they were being led deeper by unseen forces. A few men even refused to re-enter after a single experience, citing an overwhelming dread that they couldn't put into words. The officers, of course, had to maintain order. They attributed the incidents to exhaustion, claustrophobia, or the aftershocks of combat trauma. Yet even they couldn't explain the growing reports of malfunctioning equipment, the vanishing guide markers, the disembodied voices that seemed to originate from the rock itself. One lieutenant confessed privately that he had seen something carved into a wall deep inside, a name scratched in English, dated 1944. But no American soldier had ever been documented operating in Tora Bora during that time. The caves seemed timeless, bending the past and present into a blur. Some soldiers began to speculate that what they were experiencing wasn't haunting in the traditional sense. It was memory imprinted so deeply into the stone that it replayed itself, trapping anyone who entered. Not ghosts of people, but ghosts of the mountain itself. As winter set in, the caves only grew colder and more hostile. The men would return with frost clinging to their beards, their lips trembling, their stories spilling out in half-coherent whispers. They spoke less of the enemy they were sent to fight and more of the caves that seemed determined to fight them. By the end of that month, the soldiers no longer saw the caves as strategic hideouts. They saw them as living monuments of suffering, wombs of darkness that remembered every trespass. And deep down, they began to fear that once the caves remembered you, they never let you go. We thought the caves were just stone, just dust, just remnants of old wars. But that illusion shattered the first time the apparitions came. It began with shadows. At first, they appeared only in our peripheral vision, long, thin shapes stretching against the cave walls, moving as if lit by a fire that wasn't there. We all dismissed it as tricks of the flashlight beams or nerves playing games. But the shadows kept coming, even when no light source could have caused them. They slid across the rocks with a fluidity that wasn't natural, disappearing when we turned to face them directly, only to return seconds later when we looked away. One soldier, Patterson, swore that he saw a figure kneeling at the mouth of a tunnel, head bowed, as though in prayer. He thought it was an Afghan civilian, or maybe an insurgent lying in wait. But when he approached, rifle raised, the figure lifted its head. What he saw nearly made him collapse. The face wasn't whole. The eyes were empty sockets, the jaw broken, hanging at an angle no living body could sustain. Patterson fired, the shots deafening in the chamber. But when the light reached the spot, there was no one there. Only a smear of black ash that dissolved into the stone floor as we watched. After that, more of us began to see them. Some looked like soldiers dressed in outdated fatigues, Soviet uniforms with rusted helmets, their weapons slung across their backs. Others wore American gear. Though old, faded, and stained, their boots left no prints. Their mouths never moved, yet somehow when they passed, we could hear them whispering. The words were never clear, like radio static twisted into human tones, but the intent was unmistakable. They wanted us deeper. Corporal Jensen broke down during one of the patrols. He screamed that he saw his brother who had died 5 years earlier in Iraq, standing in the shadows reaching out for him. He was right there, Jensen sobbed later. He was calling my name. His lips didn't move, but I swear I heard him. We had to restrain him to keep him from following that phantom into the darkness. The apparitions grew bolder with each descent. They no longer stayed at the edges of vision. They walked openly, crossing paths in front of us, brushing our shoulders with a chill so sharp it burned like frostbite. Some moved like soldiers still caught in combat, raising invisible rifles, shouting in languages none of us could identify, then collapsing mid-step as though struck down by unseen bullets. Others simply stared, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark, their bodies half-real flickering in and out like broken film reels. The worst came when Ramirez's squad entered a cavern where the air was thick with mist. The fog clung to their clothes, coiling around their helmets. At first, they thought it was natural condensation, but then shapes began to form within it. Faces, dozens of them, some screaming, some crying, others completely expressionless. They pressed against the soldiers from all sides, cold and wet like ice-soaked fabric, until the men fled in blind terror, stumbling out into the open air. Ramirez swore afterward that the faces weren't just strangers. They were men from our own unit, some of whom were still alive. By then, even the most skeptical among us stopped joking about nerves or hallucinations. These weren't figments. The apparitions had intelligence. They moved with purpose. They watched us, studied us, and most terrifying of all, they knew us. They knew our voices, our families, our dead loved ones. They weren't random spirits. They were bait. One night, when the unit bivouacked outside the caves, Private Harris was on guard duty. He later told us he saw a woman standing at the ridgeline, her hair blowing in the mountain wind. He thought it was a civilian from the nearby village until she called his name, not his last name. His first, the way his grandmother used to say it. Harris stood frozen, rifle hanging limp at his side, as the figure beckoned him. The others found him hours later, wandering aimlessly in the dark, his lips moving as though in conversation. When they dragged him back to camp, he swore he hadn't left the fire. Every account chipped away at morale. Men started drawing symbols on their helmets, prayers scratched into the paint with knives, some tied pieces of cloth around their wrists, amulets given by Afghan locals who muttered warnings about the mountain spirits. A few even refused to enter the caves unless they carried personal tokens, dog tags from dead friends, small crosses, family photographs. They clung to them as if those objects could anchor them to reality. The apparitions didn't only appear in the caves, they followed us back to camp. Flickering figures at the edge of the firelight, cold spots in the tents where breath hung in the air like smoke, even when the night was warm. Radios crackled with voices when no one was transmitting, voices repeating our own names. One evening, a soldier woke to find someone crouched at the foot of his cot, watching him. When he scrambled for his flashlight, the cot was empty, but the fabric was still dented, as if someone had just been sitting there. The officers tried to maintain discipline, but they were no longer immune. I saw our lieutenant one morning, pale and shaking, insisting that he'd seen his father, dead for over a decade, saluting him from the mouth of the cave. He ordered us not to speak of it, but we all knew. The apparitions weren't confined to one or two unlucky men. They were everywhere, spreading like a sickness through the unit. The more we saw, the more one truth pressed on all of us. The caves weren't just haunted by individual spirits, they were haunted by the collective trauma of every soul that had ever died there. Battles didn't end in Tora Bora, they echoed, and those echoes had found us. By the time the apparitions reached their peak, none of us doubted what the locals had whispered for years, that the mountain didn't belong to the living, it belonged to the dead, and once you saw them, once you let their cold hands brush against your skin, you never truly left. By the time we reached what would later be called the breaking point, the unit was already frayed. Men were sleep-deprived, snapping at one another. Their nerves rubbed raw from the constant tension of living in a place where the enemy wasn't just flesh and blood. Some of us still believed we were fighting insurgents, that the strange events were part of some psychological warfare tactic. Others had stopped pretending altogether. They spoke openly, in hushed tones around the fire, about the mountain itself being cursed, about the caves being gates that led somewhere no man should enter. That night, we pushed deeper than ever before. The order was simple: reckon a new cavern system identified by satellite. We were told it might still be used as a weapons cache. But the way our lieutenant delivered the command, his voice brittle, eyes shifting to the caves like he already knew what was waiting for us. It didn't feel like strategy, it felt like sacrifice. We entered in silence, boots crunching on loose rock, lights casting long beams across jagged walls. Almost immediately the air grew colder. Our breath fogged the beams of our flashlights, hanging like smoke trails. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, like a blanket pressing down, muffling even the sound of our own steps. Somewhere ahead, water dripped steadily, echoing too loudly for such a small sound. The first sign that we weren't alone came when Patterson's radio hissed with static, followed by a voice. It wasn't a transmission. It was raw, like a whisper pressed directly into the frequency. "We're waiting." We froze, every man in the squad turning toward him, wide-eyed. Patterson's hands shook as he pulled the radio off his chest and slammed it against the wall. The plastic cracked. The whisper didn't stop. It just laughed. Then came the chamber. It was enormous, bigger than any we had seen before, the ceiling lost in darkness. Our lights swept across the ground, and that's when we saw them. Bodies, dozens. Maybe more. At first we thought they were insurgents recently killed, but the closer we looked, the more wrong it felt. Some wore Soviet uniforms, their helmets rusted, their boots cracked and flaking. Others were in tattered US gear from decades past. A few still had Afghan tribal dress, old rifles at their sides. The ages didn't match. They didn't belong to one battle or one war. They were stacked together, tangled like discarded puppets, their mouths open in eternal screams. Jensen whispered, This is impossible." And then the bodies moved. It wasn't sudden, not all at once. It was subtle, sickening. A hand twitching, a jaw shifting, a head turning slightly as if straining toward the sound of our breathing. One corpse sat up halfway, bones cracking, then collapsed again with a hollow thud. The stench of decay flooded the cavern, though none of them looked fresh. They were long dead, but something inside them wasn't. Ramirez shouted for us to open fire. Rifles roared, muzzle flashes, filling the chamber. Bullets tore through the bodies, ripping cloth, shattering brittle bone. But they didn't fall because they weren't standing. They writhed where they lay, twisting, clawing at the stone. And from their mouths, some broken, some jawless, came the screams. Not screams of pain, but of rage. 100 voices, all layered, all different languages, pouring out at once. The sound was unbearable. Men dropped their rifles to cover their ears, screaming themselves. It felt like the noise was inside our skulls, shaking our bones. and beneath it, threaded through the chaos, was a single unified phrase: "Join us." The temperature plummeted, our lights flickered, shadows erupted from the walls, not cast but alive, lashing toward us like tendrils. One struck Harris across the chest, knocking him flat. Another coiled around Ramirez's leg, dragging him across the ground toward the pile of corpses. We grabbed him, pulled with all our strength, boots slipping on the stone. He screamed as clawed hands, dead hands, snapped up from the pile and wrapped around him. Fingers dug into his uniform, pulling, tearing. "Don't let go," he shouted, his eyes wild, his face drenched in sweat. We pulled, but the dead pulled harder. For a moment, it felt like a tug of war between the living and the damned. Then Ramirez's scream cut off. His body jerked, twisted, and in an instant, he was gone, swallowed beneath the mountain of corpses. The pile stilled like nothing had happened. Silence fell, broken only by our ragged breathing. We backed away, weapons raised, terrified to fire again. The corpses didn't move now. They lay as they had before, lifeless, eyes staring at nothing. But we knew better. They were waiting. Patterson broke then. He dropped his rifle and bolted, sprinting for the tunnel. "We're already dead," he screamed as his voice echoed down the stone corridor. None of us chased him. We couldn't. Fear rooted us to the floor. We never saw him again. The rest of us stumbled backward, retreating step by step. Some prayed aloud. Others muttered incoherent pleas. When we finally made it to the mouth of the cave, the night air hit like salvation, burning our lungs with its sharp coldness. We collapsed outside, too shaken to speak. But none of us could forget what we had seen. Ramirez's scream, the hands. The way the bodies moved, as if one will control them all. We knew then what we hadn't wanted to admit. The caves weren't just haunted by ghosts. They were alive with something worse. Something that used the dead as puppets. Something that wanted us too. From that night on, no man entered those caverns without shaking. And though we told ourselves we would never go back, orders were orders. The mountain wasn't done with us. Not yet. The night after Ramirez was taken, the camp fell into silence. No one dared to break. Normally, soldiers cursed, laughed, argued, or at least filled the dark with idle chatter to distract themselves from fear. But that night, nothing. Only the crackle of the fire, the cold mountain wind sighing through the ridges, and the occasional pop of rock shifting in the distance. Every man sat alone with his thoughts, staring into the flames like they might offer answers. No one asked about Patterson. No one asked about Ramirez. To speak their names felt like inviting the mountain to listen. At dawn, the lieutenant called us together. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hollow, as if sleep had abandoned him completely. He didn't bark orders. He didn't shout. He just said, "We finished this." Command wants confirmation, no excuses. We all knew what he meant. Another sweep. One more dive into the belly of the caves that had already eaten 2 of our brothers alive. No one protested, not because we were brave, but because we understood something terrible. Refusal wasn't an option. Not with command, and not with the mountain. We entered the caves again, though every step felt like walking into a grave. The air seemed thicker than before, pressing against our lungs, resisting our movement. The deeper we went, the less the flashlights seemed to matter. Their beams cut only a few feet ahead, swallowed by darkness, as if the mountain itself drank the light. It was Jensen who heard the voices first. He froze, hand raised, signaling us to stop. From the black ahead came a chorus of whispers, distinct but overlapping. Russian, English, Pashto, and other tongues. None of us recognized. Some sounded like men shouting orders. Others wept, broken and exhausted. And then, among them, a voice we all knew. Ramirez. It was his voice. Clear as day, pleading, "Help me, please. Don't just leave me here." Jensen broke formation, pushing forward. We grabbed him, but his strength was wild, desperate. "It's him. He's alive," he shouted, eyes wide, streaming tears. "We can't leave him." It took 3 men to drag him back, his fists flailing, until he collapsed in sobs. But the damage was done. The whispers had grown louder, and the cave was answering. We pushed forward anyway. There was no choice, the lieutenant muttered to himself, something about needing proof, needing to see it with his own eyes. And that's when we entered the final chamber. I'll never forget that place. It was larger than the others, its ceiling rising into blackness, like the dome of some buried cathedral, and across its walls, in ragged hand-scratched lines, were carvings, names, thousands of them. Some in Cyrillic, some in English, others in symbols I couldn't decipher. They were carved so deeply into the rock that blood still seemed to glisten in the grooves, though when we touched them, our fingers came away clean. At the center of the chamber was a pit, a deep, yawning hole in the stone, too perfect to be natural, wide enough for 10 men to stand shoulder to shoulder. From it came a cold so absolute it hurt to breathe, and rising from that pit were the voices, all of them, screaming, pleading, demanding. We stood frozen as shapes began to crawl from the pit's edge, not climbing, rising as though lifted by invisible hands. They weren't whole bodies, but fragments, faces, arms, torsos, torn pieces of uniforms from a dozen armies, all stitched together by shadow. They hovered above the pit, mouths opening and closing in perfect unison, speaking as one. "You are already one of us." Jensen dropped to his knees, praying. Terrace tried to fire, but the rifle jammed. Patterson wasn't there to run this time, but every man wanted to. The lieutenant, pale as bone, whispered the words we'd all feared since the first day. It never ends. Every war, every death, this place, it keeps them. It keeps us. The apparitions surged forward. They didn't lunge like enemies. They closed in like mourners, their faces brushing ours, their hands icy against our skin. I swear I saw my father's face among them, dead 20 years, eyes blank, lips mouthing my name. For a moment, I almost stepped into their embrace. Almost. But then Daniel shouted, "Move! Now!" He hurled a grenade into the pit. The blast thundering through the chamber, shaking the walls. Dust and stone rained down as the apparitions shrieked, recoiling. That was our only chance. We ran. We ran like animals, tripping, clawing, shoving one another through the tunnels. The mountains screamed behind us, rock groaning, air vibrating with rage. Whispers chased us like hounds, brushing our ears, promising we couldn't escape. The closer we came to daylight, the more the air thinned, until finally, we burst out into the cold open night. We collapsed on the rocks outside, gasping, coughing, some crying openly. The stars above never looked so bright, so alive. But even then, none of us felt safe. We knew the mountain had let us go, for now. In the days that followed, Command filed the mission as inconclusive. Ramirez and Patterson were listed as KIA. No recovery, no mention of what we'd seen. No mention of the voices, the carvings, the pit, just another failed recon in a war full of failures. But the men who survived, we knew better. We knew the truth. The mountain wasn't just rock, it was a prison, a graveyard that never let go. The dead of every war lingered there, trapped, feeding on every soul foolish enough to enter. Tora Bora wasn't haunted, it was alive. And though I made it home, thousands of miles away, I didn't escape, because at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear them. The whispers, the march of boots echoing in the dark, and sometimes I wake to find my breath clouding in the air, as if the mountain's cold has followed me. The truth is simple. Tora Bora never ends, and once you've walked its halls, it never lets you go.